Deputy Mick Wallace to introduce these two.
Thanks, Concordia. Minister, the first question relates to the 31 vacant site levy implementation progress reports you have received from local authorities. I have received them via freedom of information, but it might be helpful if you publish them. They make for very interesting reading, and it's a pity it took so long for these progress reports to be requested. I am wondering, Minister, if your department have considered changes or amendments to the vacant site levy on the basis of the information contained in these reports, because they highlight huge problems with the site levy introduced in 2015.
Thank you, Ken Corlin. Thank you, Deputies, for the question. And I propose to take questions 68 and 117 together. Under the vacant site levy provisions of the Urban Regeneration and Housing Act of 2015, planning authorities are empowered to apply a vacant site levy of 3% of the market value of relevant vacant sites. These arrangements commenced in respect of vacant sites included on local authority vacant site registers prior to the 1st of January of last year, with payment of the levy due in January of this year. When I was appointed as Minister, I initiated a review of the measure and introduced amendments under the Planning and Development Amendment Act of 2018 aimed at further strengthening the vacant site levy provisions. These amendments include increasing the rate of the levy from 3 to 7% for sites on local authority vacant site registers from 2019 onwards, and the removal of the possibility of applying reduced or zero rates of levy for sites on registers that are subject to a site loan which is greater than a specified percentage of the market value of the site, reflecting the improved economic circumstances and higher property prices since the levy measure was originally introduced. The inclusion of sites on the vacant site registers continues to be determined by the criteria provided for in Section 5 of the 15 Act, subject to the site not exceeding 0.05 hectares in area. And I'm satisfied, Deputy, that the existing minimum size threshold of 0.05 hectares reflects the appropriate size of a vacant site that should be targeted with a view to maximising return from the measure, thereby enhancing its effectiveness. And just to give some context, 0.05 hectares is about 500 metres squared, or about 5% of the size of a rugby pitch, on which you could possibly build a maximum of 2 to 3 small houses or 3 to 4 small apartments. My department does not maintain a central register of vacant sites, as each local authority administers the vacant site register in respect of their functional area. But a recent review of the online vacant site registers across all local authority areas shows there are collectively over 360 individual sites currently on local registers. Over 120 of these sites were entered on the local vacant site registers on the 1st of January of last year and are therefore subject to the levy this year in 19, unless development works are activated in the interim. And as of March, the 14th of March of 2019, sites with a value of €416 million were listed on local authority vacant site registers, of which €281 million relates to sites listed on the registers prior to the 1st of January of last year. Without any changes to the number of sites currently listed on local authority registers, it's estimated that the levy proceeds nationally could be of the order of €8.4 million, applying the current 3% levy rate in respect of sites on the registers in 2018, increasing to €29.1 million in 2020, applying the increased 7% levy rate in respect of sites listed on local authority registers in 2019. Levy implementation progress reports were requested from local authorities late last year, and all local authorities have submitted responses. These responses are currently being examined by my department with a view to determining what, if any, further implementation supports may be required, and also publishing the progress reports. And I can, in the meantime, arrange for copies of the progress reports to be made available to the Deputy if he so wishes. Thank you.
Thanks, Concordia. Minister, first of all, Concordia, have I 2 minutes this time? Yeah, Minister, the changes you brought in to the vacant site levy are not near enough, and the idea that this was going to tackle land banking has not worked. 100% it hasn't worked, and I'm wondering if there's any interest in doing anything about it. And just in relation to the vacant site levy implementation progress reports, I have one here from Wicklow. They analysed the 158 sites they looked at, right? And they highlighted a lack of clear understanding and interpretation of the legislation by internal staff in other local authorities and the department. And they talk about the lack of consistency in decision-making from on board Penala in regard to Section 5(6). Now, this is actually a very good report from Wicklow. Well, I want to hear from Wexford, and it's rubbish. They only looked at 4 sites in the whole county. So what's going on? So, are they not able to do it? Do they not have the staff? And he's going to do anything about it? Because that doesn't make any sense. The Wicklow one is comprehensive, Wexford one isn't. So maybe they don't have the people. If they haven't got the people, maybe you give them to them. And if you don't think the local authorities can do it, why don't you just get someone else to do it? Maybe the independent planning regulator should be brought in and if you are not prepared to give the power, or if the local authorities don't actually have the mind to do it. You talked about vacant site, right? There's 162 in Dublin. Now, I actually was the one who argued for 0.05 back in 2015, because you had it at 0.01. But in actual fact, when I look at the Dublin City Council report, I'm actually thinking now, maybe I went too big. And you say that you only put a couple of houses or a couple of apartments on less than 0.5. I could put 12 apartments on 0.5, and you could put at least 8 on 0.03, right? No problem, maybe 10, right? But I tell you what, it might be hard for people to get finance to build out a small site, and that's very understandable. The local authority should look at buying the 162 sites and building them out themselves.
We'll come back to the Minister.
Thank you, Corla, and thank you, Deputy. And yes, finance for small sites, particularly infill sites, can be quite complicated because there can be many difficulties, and the local authority in Dublin City found that itself very recently when it looked at a particular site in the city centre. I'm sorry to race through my initial answer because there was a lot in it, but just to point out that there are currently 360 sites across the country now on registers. There's more than €400 million worth of land under levy, and this year now the 7% rate, the new rate which I brought in, is now in effect, which means over the 2-year period that's a 10% levy on the value of that site. It's worth noting, I think, that 42 sites have now come off the register since it was first compiled. Why? Because construction has commenced and completed in some instances on those sites. So that is successful. We think about 42 sites in a scheme of 360 sites actually seeing construction completed because a levy was put in on that vacant site. Many more sites actually would be on the register, but for the fact that the levy was introduced, and we decided that we were going to more than double it for the course of this year. And I am reviewing the reports, and yes, you're right, there's a different picture in different local authorities. That's why we will help local authorities that need that help. But I still think the local authority is the best placed, with their local knowledge, to actually compile and maintain their registers of those sites in their own functional areas.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Deputy Wallace.
Thanks, Corla. Minister, you're going to bring in something like 10 million or so on those sites you're talking about, because it was 3% of approximately 300 million, right? And it'll be 7% next year, whatever, right? As you know, I've been advocating in my bill for 25%, right? Something that would be really encourage them not to bank land. Mel Reynolds has pointed out that in Dublin alone, it could bring in close to 300 million if he's tapped into all the sites in 1 year in terms of a levy. Right? Now, then we'd be talking about bringing the price down. At the moment, I had a girl ring me at the weekend about looking at a house, wondering should she buy it, a 3-bed over 30 kilometres from here, right? And they were looking 330,000. 330,000 for a 3-bed? I can tell you it's half that in mainland Europe, right? And you are not going to get the price of the housing down if you don't tackle land banking. And your site levy is not workable. It isn't going to make a difference. And there's huge concerns about the definition of what even constitutes a vacant site. And I mean, I pointed out some examples at the committee.
Thank you, Deputy.
I was supposed to get 2 minutes, Corla.
No, you get 1 minute this time, so we'll hear your response.
Right.
But Deputy, this isn't a revenue-raising measure. We didn't bring in the vacant site levy to bring in money. We brought in the vacant site levy to get the land to be used for development. So we're not going to measure this based on how much money we bring in. We're going to measure it based on how many sites we actually get under construction as a result of bringing in the levy. And as I said, 42 sites now have development happening on them since we've brought in this levy. And we did more than double it to 7%, but over the 2-year period, that becomes 10%. And that is punitive. If someone has a piece of land worth 1 million, which actually isn't very much for a piece of land, they're liable to €100,000 to have to pay on that. It's a 10%. And we're actually seeing proof of it now, Deputy, that the levy that we've put in place is moving sites from vacancy into construction. But the important thing to note as well is we're not just using the vacant site levy to get land moving. We've also got the Land Development Agency bringing forward state land to make sure that we are progressing massive state land banks that are there that aren't being used efficiently. So when we look at the different individual measures that we have under Rebuilding Ireland, from the Land Development Agency all the way through to our vacancy officer teams, all the way through to the vacant site levy, this is about getting land moving and getting it built. Thank you, Corla.